welcome to episode 10 of First Person Podcast, a monthly podcast put on by the editors of First Person Scholar. I'm Emma Boston, editor-in-chief of First Person Scholar, and this month we have my last ever podcast with FPS, and we're going to be talking about women's sexuality in video games. We have 5 editors with us today, including Alex, Betsy, Judy, Elise, and myself. And in this episode, we cover a lot of topics that aren't usually covered in game studies. These include having sexual or romantic feelings for video game characters, queer representation in games, and how the male gaze functions while gaming. I hope you enjoy listening to this podcast as much as I enjoyed recording it.
I'm Betsy. You can find me on Twitter at BetsyBray.
I'm Elise. I'm at Visticuffs.
I'm Emma, and my Twitter is Emma H. Fossum.
I'm Alex, and I'm at Alex G. Orlando.
I'm Judy, and you can find me on Twitter at Judebird.
So this is my last podcast, and because of that, I'm really pumped to return to a topic that came up a lot when we recorded the Dragon Age podcast, which is female sexuality in video games. So there are a few really obvious types of female sexuality that we see in games, most obviously being hypersexualized female characters created for the male gaze. So I'm sure that will come up in this podcast, but I also suspect that we'll queer that topic a lot as well. And also sort of get into talking about less obvious types of sexuality and the types of sexuality that people maybe don't think of when they think of sexuality in games. So to start off really generally, what is the first time you remember being sexually attracted or having sexual feelings about someone in a video game? And second part, separate question, who was your first video game crush?
It is good to separate those two.
Yeah, right?
I think.
Who was your first video game crush? And I was like, wait, but also...
My first crush was Link, specifically like from Ocarina of Time when he was older. Because like...
not the baby Link.
No, because baby Link is my friend, would be my best friend. And so that's like, he would be like a guy I would hang out on the playground with. Yeah. But adult Link was just like, that's my boyfriend. Yeah. Absolutely. I was just like, Link will be my boyfriend. He had that cool earring, which I mean, come on, really. And that hair, I don't know. It's like what I'm all about when you're like a kid, right? He's pretty cool.
Yeah, when you made all those weird suggestive grunts.
Yeah. You could fill in the blanks. That was my crush. I don't think I was ever sexually attracted to Link because it's just like, you can't work with that. You can't.
Work with that.
I don't know, right? Like there's nothing there. And I didn't understand. I don't think I quite grasped.
But you wanted him to be your boyfriend.
Yeah, he was my boyfriend. Absolutely. But my like first, I think sexual, I didn't think of this part, but like the automatic thing for me was Dante from Devil May Cry. Yeah. And I don't know why, because the white hair is like old manish. But he was really cool. Like, he was cool in ways that Link is not in many ways.
Cool.
He doesn't, you know. But yeah, he's so cool. He's talking to demons like they speak English.
So, like, I never really played video games until I was already a grown-up. So I didn't have, like, a sexual awakening to video games. And so my first video game crush and my first, like, sexual attraction to a video game character would have been Liara from Mass Effect. I mean, that was before I knew I had, like, genuine attraction to ladies.
Then how can you say you didn't have a sexual awakening via video game?
But I didn't like... I guess so. I didn't acknowledge it. That's what it is. My awakening would have been Leliana in Dragon Age Origins.
Right.
Whereas my first crush was Liara, and I was desperate to get her to like me. And I fell in love with Alistair in Dragon Age. But I was like, I really want to flirt with Leliana, and I don't really know why.
You're all gonna groan at me for this one, but I would say the first time I looked at a video game character and I was like, there's a sexual thing about you that is appealing, definitely Lara Croft. I was just like,
oh, I thought you were gonna say Fenris.
No,
I was just like gonna grab the figure and like.
No, I mean, I think it makes sense.
It's not a bad answer. It makes total sense.
How can you look at Lara Croft and not have sexual feelings is the question.
Literally impossible. My actual first game crush, y'all heard this in the Dragon Age podcast. I love Anders so much. It's horrible. It's horrible. I hate it, but I love him so much.
I was trying to think about this because crush versus sexual attraction was very, very different. I remember playing a lot of SNES games when I was young. And did you guys play Chrono Trigger? I I definitely had my first crush on one of the female characters in that game, Luca, the really nerdy inventor girl, because she was always like in the background and fixing every problem with a screwdriver and just being all like, I can fix this easily. And
awesome.
she was just so cool. And like Chrono never paid attention to her because she wasn't the pretty girl. And I was just like, she's so cool. I want to be her friend. But in a very not that way.
In a way that looking back on it, you're like, oh.
I was like, I think I had a crush on her. But yeah, that was like when I was very young. Like I think I played Chrono Trigger when I was, 9 or 10 or something, or maybe younger. I guess my first sexual attraction to a video game character was probably Jill Valentine from Resident Evil. Like, even though, even though when the movie came out, I was just like, she was hot, but just they put her in this really stupid outfit that was just like not something that she could really do badass things in. And I was like, you look too.
So the sexiness of Jill Valentine was like how she acted.
Yeah, like how she acted, and she was very badass. And then the movie came out, and I was like, that's gonna be awesome. And I was like, I like her less. And then I was all about friggin' Mila Jovovich after that.
Part of the reason why I had to separate this question is because the first time sexually attracted, I have this like very distinct memory of being like super young, like probably like 9 or 10, and playing Shadow Warrior, really stupid. And now that I look back, like super racist FPS. Part of the game mechanic was this sort of horrible thing where like hidden Easter eggs around the game were naked anime girls.
All right.
So, for example, you could, I don't know, walk behind a waterfall, and instead of there being like a treasure chest with some rupees, it's a naked anime girl.
Oh my god.
All right then.
And
like you capture them or something? Like
That's a different game.
Yeah.
That is a different game.
You could kill them.
Oh gosh.
Because it was the 90s. One time there was like one who you could walk into like a bathroom and she was in there taking a shit. That was a really like interesting.
How old were you?
Probably like, this is the funny thing is my mom would have never let me play this game, but it was a game I borrowed from a friend and he told me about the naked anime girls. Yeah, thanks bud. I remember looking for all these naked anime girls and it being not even just the first sexual attraction in video games, probably like one of the first types of porn I was ever even exposed to.
Right.
Like I can't think of anything before that was like straight up pornographic that I would have seen. Me and my brother had like an understanding where we were just like, let's just find all the rest of these anime girls.
We found one, right?
We both equally invested. My first full-out crush would have been easily, no question, been Zelda. And, like, I think in that case, kind of like similar to what you were saying about Link, is like there was no sexual aspect to it. For me, it was just very much like I was Link, and I needed Zelda to be my girlfriend more than anything in the entire world. Like, nothing else mattered. So it's pretty obvious that female sexuality is really marginalized in games. So what are some more examples we can think of where female sexuality was actually more prominent? Not an optional focus. We're not talking Bioware here.
Well, when you say female sexuality, though, do you mean like, you don't mean like as a playable character, you mean like represented in some way? Because
I guess I mean just like represented in a way that is a prominent part of the game.
Well, I'm thinking about like Ada Wong in the Resident Evil games because her sexuality is a huge part of her character. It's not necessarily her sexual behaviors or anything like that, but it's that her sexuality is a key part of who she is and what she does throughout the game and her character as a whole.
Ada Wong's a great example though because she's got almost like she's got like a Bayonetta thing going on, right? Where there's that specific type of female character who's maybe has got the femme fatale sort of trope going on, but also is like sexual in a way that feels somehow less male gazy and more like it's like using your sexuality as a weapon or something.
It's just her jam. That's her thing.
Yeah, exactly. It just seems...
It doesn't seem forced on her or anything like that. It seems like a very natural way for her to act and in a way that I think is a little bit more comfortable. I'm not saying it isn't without its problems, of course, but it did come across to me as a little bit less forced or weird or shoved in there.
Yeah, because I guess there's sort of like a ludonarrative dissonance about Lara Croft specifically and people complaining like, why is she wearing this? Why are her boobs like this? If what she's doing is Indiana Jonesing. And there's always this aspect with Lara Croft where she's always going to be sort of like a female Indiana Jones. But with Ada Wong, it seemed like it all sort of
worked together.
More cohesive.
Yeah.
Maybe. And same with Bayonetta. Yeah.
I mean, Bayonetta is, I guess, the obvious answer, but I think a lot of fighting game characters also are like that, and I know some are a little bit more like gratuitous than others.
So
but
are we talking about female sexuality as an object of the male gaze, or are you looking for those examples of female sexuality that feel like genuine expressions of sexuality and sexual desire from the characters.
I mean, I think it's hard to tear those two things apart, right?
Yeah, I suppose part of it's going to be just how you personally relate to that character. But I feel like there's a difference between the Lara Croft kind of sexuality and something like Isabella in Dragon Age, who is a very sexual character, and it is kind of male gazy, but you also get narrative about her sexuality and her sexual choices and agency. Is it worth making that difference clear?
I mean, like, I'd make the argument that, like, although a lot of female fighting game characters are obviously for the male gaze, I think there was something profound, at least when I was younger, about playing those fighting games and realizing that that's one of those genres where women are exactly on equal front as men for the most part. You're generally going to be seeing women who are sexually empowered, or maybe not typically. Like, I think even Chun-Li, right? Like, she's got her thunder thighs, and that's kind of like a Bayonetta thing for a lot of people, where it's like intimidating for a lot of people, or they don't see that as sexual or like empowering or appealing. But for me, Chun-Li's awesome because she can kick any of the male characters' butt without having like to wear a bikini or anything like that.
Because I guess that's the thing with fighting games specifically too, is like, even though there isn't necessarily like a forward narrative there, they're not sidekicks.
There's a difference between sexualized and sexual, and that's something that I'm not sure is distinguishable in games that don't actually allow you to get to know that character. That's always the excuse that people make when they like that character who breathes through her skin, and so therefore she wears like nothing.
Yeah.
It's like, well, that's just how she has to be because of truth. And it's like, yeah, but you made her up, so you are sexualizing her. She is not a sexual person deciding to be naked all the time or whatever.
Well, I mean, when you asked that question, the first thing I thought about was Catherine, just because it's the weirdest, but maybe also best example of female sexuality for the male gaze as a cultural critique, a really warped one, and as a character that is like entirely built on this one stereotype of sexuality. Either of the Catherine characters are defined by how they behave sexually. It makes up their entire characters like in an opposite way from each other. So
because the two Catherines, their two traits are like, one's really, really clingy and frigid, right? And the other one is like hypersexualized cool and also terrifying.
Yeah. She's like the cool girl, but also really, really forward in a super creepy way, and kind of makes the male character do things he doesn't want to do, and like makes him question his morals and blah blah blah. And it's a very, the whole game is really weird because it's a lot of bad stereotypes about women, and it's all about the male gaze in terms of how all of the men who are like literally turning into sheep are being manipulated by women who are either hypersexualized and trying to get something out of them, or the ones who are really frigid. And the sexy, enticing Catherine is in the game, she seems more like an idea than an actual person, because she doesn't really seem to have much of a personality or definition on her own. It's all just about her being, metaphorically, she's supposed to be like some kind of parasite really in the game. That's how I felt, really. She just did not seem to have any kind of personality except for like being needy to the extreme.
So according to Catherine, then female sexuality is either dangerous and violent or
non-existent.
Non-existent.
Well, and that's kind of like one of the questions I have about these sort of hypersexual and sexualized female characters. Are they empowering in the sense that they're depicting women as having sexuality, or because of the audience of video games being what it is, are they there as a male fantasy, as in like, imagine this girl who all she wants is sex, or imagine if women were as sexual as this.
Imagine if women were always sexually available to you for kindness coins.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's weird because, like, as much as I love seeing women being sexual in media, full stop, you always stop and you're like, wait, is this for me though?
Yeah.
Is this a woman being sexual for women, or is this a woman being sexual for men? And then this is complicated again when you're attracted to women, because you're like, oh, to what extent can I co-opt women being sexual for men and just enjoy it for myself? Oh shit.
Well, you can think of and you can like apply that same mentality to anything, like
to what extent am I a subject, not an object, a subject of the male gaze?
Well, and then to what degree am I participating in these sort of hurtful cycles that we have in media in the first place, just because I am attracted to women? So it's like, I don't want to be part of what I perceive as a problem in the portrayal of women in media, but
But she
Absolutely.
was sexy.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. Like you
That's a
can't
tough call.
you can't look at Lara Croft and pretend she's not sexy.
Yeah.
She's literally, she's not a real person. She's not an actress. She's literally crafted for you to be sexually attracted to. Well, on that note, though, like with the she's not an actress, when the movie came out, I, recall feeling totally different things. Like, on the one hand, I thought she's so much sexier because she's a human. And then on the other hand, there were so many parts of the movie that I found really, really gratuitous to the point where I was like, I get this is supposed to be sexy, but as a woman, nobody would do this. Like, nobody would, nobody would pose like this. Nobody would actually do these things. It's not sexy to me because it's not real. It's not a real portrayal of a woman. And it's like 100% fan service. And I can't enjoy it because
you actually
it's just
feel
too
yourself
unnatural.
hitting the wall of the male gaze.
That's what I felt when I saw that movie, even though I was like, these parts are sexy, but some of these other parts are totally ridiculous. Like,
I wonder how that's going to change as we get these increasingly uncanny valley, and eventually we will exit the uncanny valley, like photorealistic actor CGI capture portrayals of video game characters. I think it's Jess Aldridge who did a lot of research on like what immerses us when we're playing video games, and what she found and what the research shows is that the less photoreal character is, the more we are likely to identify with that character, because obviously there's less stuff to remind us that this is like not me, or this is not the real Luke Skywalker or whatever.
I'm sorry, that was a really that was an interesting jump. How do you
because the research is about like that really early Atari Star Wars game that's literally like, you're Luke Skywalker, it's literally a dot. I wonder if it's easier to ignore the wall of the male gaze. I like that as a metaphor, hitting the wall of the male gaze. I wonder if it's easier to shift through that wall in a video game where it's not a real person's body. I mean, that's the research you were doing about comics porn, right? It's not a real body.
Yeah, and especially if there are no cutscenes. In a cutscene, you're essentially like film. But if it's not a cutscene, you actually get to control how you see those bodies.
Right, you get to control if you linger on her boobs or her butt.
I don't know if this is the case for everyone, but it seems like the less realistic the character, the more interested we seem to be in them, like romantically or sexually even.
I remember when you streamed the, Dead or Alive, and you're just totally disinterested. And you're like, much more interested in picking out a cute swimsuit than I am at looking at this stuff.
I did like moving the camera though, and that was just like, I was like, there was a volleyball game happening. I think I was supposed to be playing the volleyball game. And you can actually take the camera just right in. And like to the point where you can't play the game anymore.
Full screen anime titty.
Yeah.
No.
We can say it once, right?
This is my last podcast. This is the last chance I have to say anime titty on this podcast.
We're not allowed to say that. Okay, good to know.
That reminds me, I was watching some like top 10 achievements you don't want anyone to see you have on your gamer score, and one of them is in that like zombie cheerleader video game.
Chainsaw Lollipop.
Yeah, and there's an achievement for looking up her skirt.
That's right.
And it's and so like it's embarrassing because the achievement is like, I didn't do it on purpose or something, and then the description is like looking up her skirt or something. So it's an achievement that's supposed to shame you, but it's an achievement. And people are achievement hunters.
Right. Yeah. So
you
can't ask him to do it.
It's encouraging you to look up Juliet's skirt at that point.
Yeah.
I've played Horizons 2, and that is a series of gay games, like just homoerotic, various simple mini games even. And people in the comments section of that game are like, how do I delete this, like, from my Steam? Because, like, you get achievements in that. And, like, literally,
Amazing.
People are just, like, freaking out because, like, they moved that popsicle in the guy's mouth for too long and got the achievement.
Oh, my God.
And so it's...
And then everyone on who can see your Steam profile can see you got an achievement.
That you played that game. And it's...
Woo!
Yeah, so, like, gay panic in the reviews of Horizons 2 on Steam. Check it out.
Oh my God.
Don't they know you can just play in offline mode? Like, it's like incognito, but for Steam.
In Megan Blythe Adams' article, Renegade Sex, one of the things she talks about is this concept of talking about queer representation in reference to Bioware games, and how one of the big problems with that is that you can just avoid it almost completely. And she brings up this concept of what she calls like the gay button, right? That you can basically avoid all that content if you want to, unless you literally press, in some cases, the gay button. You pick the gay option. To what extent, you know, when we think about female sexuality in games, we think about queer female sexuality or queer sexuality in games, a lot of times we think about Bioware. But is that really representation if X% of people who play it don't access that content? Is that different than representation like a queer character on a TV or a queer character in a movie?
Or is it just sort of the same thing as queer baiting but slightly less violent? Right, because at least we get it.
Yeah, we
at
do
least
get it.
We get the queer.
Don't take it away from me, please.
Yeah, right. Yeah, at least they're
the
not denying us the queer moments in the way that queer baiting on a TV show does.
Are there stats on like who picks what relationships? Because I'd imagine like you're more likely to get straight gamers picking a lesbian relationship.
Almost all the straight men I know who I've seen play a Bioware game within the past year, actually they all played as a female character and they all romanced a woman.
There's actually less queer male content in Bioware games than queer female content. And like people have speculated that obviously the reason for that is because straight male gamers will be upset if they accidentally click the gay button. For a straight male player, the queer female content would be additional straight content.
And like women are obviously socialized to be significantly more comfortable with the idea of another woman as sexual because of the male gaze. Like, there's no version of gay chicken for women.
No.
Have you guys ever played gay chicken?
Usually it's just straight girls make out at parties.
I was about to say,
I don't know what gay
the
chicken is.
Gay chicken is when like two straight guys touch each other in increasingly sexual ways, and the first one to give up is the loser. The more straight and heterosexual you are, the less afraid you are of looking gay.
Right.
So the person who's most afraid of looking gay is
the gayest.
The gayest, okay.
But if you like it too much, then everyone knows you're gay. So you can't. You have to win, but you can't want to play.
Amazing. That's the greatest description.
Fucking amazing.
One thing that gets talked about a lot in porn theory is about how in straight male porn, like, guys actually prefer an uglier dude because if a dude is too attractive and you put him in straight male porn, then like you might feel something.
Accidentally get turned on.
Yeah,
while
exactly.
You're watching porn.
Like they want the guy to just
button.
be a dick. They don't want him to have a face, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Well, I also read though, like I don't even remember where, that having a more unattractive dude allows like the guy watching it to just kind of picture themselves
that too
as that. Like that was like Ron Jeremy's entire success. Like
it's me. Just imagining. Imagine
me.
someone
I can get hot women
looking at Ron Jeremy and saying, "It me."
that is what he based his whole career on.
It's such a caricature of a particular type of porn that like he hardly feels like a real person. But he is. Maybe he wouldn't like us.
We're very sorry, Ron Jeremy.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sure you're a great person.
I'm sure a lot of other things have been said about him that are way worse.
So changing the topic completely.
Or getting it back on track, probably.
So we talked about how, maybe photorealism isn't the best way to create more attraction or create better romances or anything like that. But people will say like, oh, there isn't more sex in games because it's hard to depict.
There are like 1 billion adult games. There are multiple series that are just straight up gay adult games. Like you play as a character, you go through various narratives, you romance different characters. They're all men. They're all different archetypes. And then there are like cut scenes that are extremely graphic. So it's not actually hard to do anything. And they're mostly anime. Like, so it's not really any different. I've seen a lot of those.
Yeah, I'm thinking more like not dating simulators, not porn games, but just like sex included in the narrative of games in the same way it would be included in the narrative of any action adventure film.
Yeah, I mean what you're talking about, like the Bioware effect, where there's this like really intense narrative emotional connection, and then there's the sex cutscene, and it's just like two CGI bodies bonking against each other,
flopping it.
Yeah. Judy brings up a really good point. That's just more of an excuse rather than an actual problem, right? If it is possible to create sexual and like appealing sex scenes in CGI, it is possible. We're just afraid of depicting actual sex.
For a lot of games, it wouldn't be a priority. So they would say, oh, we don't really have the time to animate this scene because it's not integral to the plot. But there's so many ways to imply that sex is happening even. At least like put that idea in the minds of the players and have it be like a thing you can do. There's so many ways to represent it that don't involve like difficult animation, and it's no harder to animate a sex scene than it is like a fighting scene. It's
and it's
it's
a commercial issue too, right? Because I think for some reason people are way more sensitive to sex in games, and like there's this idea that like parents have no problem buying their kids GTA or whatever, but like as soon as that hot coffee scene came out, that's when the controversy started.
It's like that is the least of your
You know what I
worries.
mean? So it's just like there's something about the inherent aspect of games as teaching children something or having them act out something that you don't want your kids to get their hands on. Like it's
So,
this huge taboo thing.
If you're a company like Bioware, it's accepted that your games are chock full. I mean, they could be fuller, but like
Title of the podcast?
they could, but that your games have a lot of sex. But if you don't have that reputation,
I mean, even then, the way that Bioware animates sex, I think, is intentionally unsexy because, like, the kiss scenes are good, and then you move to the sex, and it's this like really awkward fumbling, clearly badly animated, and I can only imagine it's on purpose.
I mean, I was going to say the same thing with Isabella, just that there's this, I don't know, you pick her up or she picks you up or whatever, or something happens and it's hot. You get on the bed and it's just like, what? No, stop.
What are our hands?
Yeah, exactly.
You feel like almost embarrassed to watch yourself, even though you like worked for it.
Yeah, you're like, this is all I want.
You're like,
This is what I was working for.
I did 10 hours.
This is not what I imagined in my head is what the characters would look like.
And the point at which it becomes sex is when it starts being unsexy.
So you guys are saying it's anticlimactic.
We walked right into it, folks.
I'm sorry, I just encouraged you by laughing.
Yes, one laugh.
That's the ultimate pun. One laugh.
That was amazing.
1 out of 4. Sorry, Betsy, you were going to say something. I cut you off.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I'm thinking about sex scenes in Dragon Age Inquisition now, as long as we're talking about BioWare. And I felt like a lot of the sex scenes were very carefully modeled in that game because you have different possible avatars.
Yeah, and I think we can stop talking about BioWare after this, I promise. What's really exciting about the sex in Inquisition is how kinky it is, right? Because you have at least two characters. You have Bull and Dorian, with whom you have kinky sex. And it's explicitly kinky.
Mm.
You have a conversation about safe words with Iron Bull, right?
So, I mean,
it's just like a really fruitful, real depiction of sexuality.
Exactly.
Like,
so it's like that is sexy in a way that the two animated bodies bumping into each other in Origin and 2 are not.
it's like two fish on land.
Well, since Two Fish on Land, that's a very good bridge to this. What's the worst representation of sex or alternatively sexuality that you've ever seen in a video game?
God of War.
I feel like it's hard not to think of God of War.
Is that the like buttons?
That's where you rotate 90 degrees until you knock the vase off the table and get the experience points.
Yeah, any video game sex that's like press A to boob is
Triangle.
just like not going to be good.
Well, I mean, what it does is, it shows you the two ladies in Kratos on the bed, and then it pans over to the bedside table with the vase on it, and you're like, triangle, triangle, and if you're hitting the right buttons, the bed bumps into the nightstand, and if you do it right, aka vigorously, we'll say enough, you knock it off the table, and you get the experience points that are inside of it.
So it's a combination of kind of like stupid because of QuickTime events, but also stupid because you don't even get to see it.
I don't know if I would want to for that.
Well,
case.
there's a couple of sex scenes that you interact with in God of War games, and there's one where you watch two naked women get turned on by your sex.
Oh
so
God,
you don't get to see get to see the sex, but you get to see the two
extra ladies
be aroused by how good you are at sex.
Yeah, that's the one where
triangle.
Yeah, like they look at you and they start getting like all sexual with themselves and each other the better you're doing.
Yeah.
And they get bored if you're not doing that.
I feel like that's just like one of those examples that's just so clearly male fantasy that you just hit that wall of the male gaze right away.
Yeah,
like,
no,
like,
that weirded me out so much when I saw that. I was just like, what is happening here?
And if I can see this, why can't I see the sex, right? If
There's a dick in there to be gay.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Don't hit the gay button.
Yeah.
That's obviously one on the controller next to triangle.
I'm trying to think of other bad examples. There's got to be more than that.
There's like the obvious horrible sex games, right? The like Custer's Last Stand, which is just a rape game, and then there's like Leisure Suit Larry, which is kind of horrifying. But like they're just like the stereotypical shitty sex in games.
Well, I mean, we talked about it earlier too, but like when I played Dead or Alive Extreme 3, there's something called owner mode, which is basically like you're taking the perspective of Zach, who's another character who owns the island, basically. So he's another character in Dead or Alive, and you basically play the male gaze, and you control what he's looking at. And you can shift it over to girl mode when you want to play volleyball, as we all do.
Obviously.
And that's like, I as much as I joke about it, it's not only just a bad game, but it's just like, I don't want to sit here just moving the camera and look at these girls. It leaves nothing to the imagination, in my opinion. But then some of the games that are not volleyball are just so dumb but they're supposed to be enticing, but I'm like, no, this is just horrible. When she's sleeping on the bed and she's literally like starfishing because she's tired, I guess because I put her in the sun all day without giving her sunscreen because I couldn't afford it. And you're just like, again, moving the camera while she's sleeping and like,
At what point is that just like is that even a game? Is that even a game with sex in it anymore, or is that just porn?
It's not really a game.
What about the opposite? What's the sexiest thing you've ever seen in a game? Betsy's making a face. It's got to do with Anders.
No, actually, I was really disappointed by that whole romance. Actually,
so what's the face for?
Oh, I'm trying really hard to think, and I'm struggling.
That Iron Bull scene's pretty good.
Yeah,
I have to admit that sold me on Dragon Age in general. I think I was just like, all right. I can get behind the series. Anything in that game surpasses anything in Mass Effect.
I talked about this on another podcast, but I'm still not over Firewatch. The whole game is done on walkie-talkies. Basically, there's essentially what is like a phone sex scene. Mm-hmm. And so like you spend all your time talking to this other person and getting to know this other person and falling in love with this other person. And there's just this one scene where he says something like, if I had my way, like I'd pick up that bottle of alcohol and I'd walk all the way over to your tower and we'd like sit and have a drink together. And she's like, yeah, and then what would you do? And it just goes black. It gave me like goosebumps. They didn't actually show anything, but it wasn't implied. It was very obvious what happened after that. And like, it was weirdly sexier than any actual sex scenes I think I'd ever seen in a game.
We're nearing the end, so I don't know if this question was on your list, but I know one of the things you and I had talked about when we were talking about this was there are so many queer women in game studies. Why? So like, we've been talking about our experiences and our like sexual relationship to games and how we see sexuality happening in games. It can't be a coincidence.
No.
So is it just that like fields like game studies and fan studies are new enough that we're all just like, I'm gay, deal with it, I'm queer, deal with it, whatever, and we're all just cool with it? Or is there something about these fields that are queer that attract us, that make space for us in a way that other fields don't?
I think if it was the second thing, then there would be like also a crazy amount of gay dudes in game studies. Not that there aren't, I know a lot of gay dudes in game studies, but it's not the same amount. It is like, I know many, 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 many more queer women in game studies. And I don't know, I've thought a lot about this and I don't have a really obvious answer. Like the best I can come up with is a kind of crappy answer about maybe it is that, you know, games are, and like throughout our childhood, were made for men. And if you were attracted to women, you felt a little bit less shoved out by them. Like one of the things I always think of is, you know, when I would hear people say like, oh, I want to be Zelda and I want to save Link, I'd think like, oh, I don't want to do that. Like, or like, why can't I be Peach and save Mario? Like, oh, I don't really get it. And like, I think that was maybe because maybe the fact that like I wanted Zelda to be my girlfriend made it easier for me to be Link and not feel like I wasn't Link. I don't know.
You wanted to save Zelda because you wanted Zelda.
Yeah, so I fell into that same trap that they were designing for boys. As soon as you asked that, Elise, like the answer seems kind of obvious to me just because women in general, not just queer women, but any female gamer from childhood was playing a lot of things, you know, geared towards boys and having to fit themselves into a male role and feel either comfortable with that or uncomfortable with that. And I guess game studies for me has always been, I don't know, allowed me to be a lot more critical of what things are designed for and who things are designed for and like what the gaze has to do with everything. I mean, I see a lot of correlation between game studies and film studies, and there are a lot of queer women in film studies too.
Yes, that's true. I used to do porn studies, and it's been something that's been raised in porn studies a lot. You know, like someone will just come out and just be like, hey, how come like a huge proportion of porn scholars are bi? And it's like, well, makes it a lot easier to watch a lot of porn. You know, sure makes it easier to put yourself into multiple different perspectives, and obviously you can't understand other perspectives and other orientations as well as your own, but it kind of gives you a more liminal role, I guess. But yeah, no, it's a really good question that I think about a lot and that I don't have a good answer for.
I mean, I'm sure a big part of it is that at the very least in the lefty commie academic circles that we run in, it's just more acceptable to be gay, lesbian, bi, trans. It's not perfect, but it is more accepted.
Look at CGSA this year, which is a humanities conference in Canada, and we were the first group to have pronoun ribbons. And everyone stopped us and was super interested in that on our name tags.
Yeah, I think it's this funny thing where, like, because game studies is a volatile space in the sense that all these things are on the table and, you know, Gamergate makes everything a reality and those sorts of things. I think sometimes it's easy to overlook in what ways that is weirdly better than being in a field where everything is repressed, everything's under the table.
When we met the woman at the conference who was asking us about the name tags in particular, and she said, oh, your field must be so inclusive. And I was like, don't laugh. But then I was like, but it is. But it isn't.
Yeah.
It's like aggressive, but it's also, it's a fascinating field to be in. And sometimes it's a wildly uncomfortable one. And sometimes I'm glad that we're here.
Well, yeah, like being inclusive in a field kind of just opens up so many other things. Like when you're inclusive, it means you can be critical about many things that people normally aren't, and then you get a lot of backlash. And that's a bad thing, but also a good thing.
Yeah.
Well, and like I didn't used to be in game studies, and for me, like the thing that made the difference, weirdly enough, was that when everyone started talking about harassment and sexism in games and stuff like that, which, you know, maybe seems like we've always been talking about it, but it only really became such a normal thing in the past couple of years. Like, I know that when I was in my first year of my PhD only 4 years ago, it still felt taboo to talk about sexism in games and to talk about gender in games. It still felt like talking about gender in games wasn't game studies, it was cultural studies. But now we're to the point where you cannot ignore that is like an integral part talking about games. So I think acknowledging sexism always makes space more inclusive. What do we think the future of sex and sexuality in video games look like?
I know that I was really impressed when I played Sibel recently because it's a game entirely about sex and entirely about sexuality that isn't actually putting it visually out there. It's certainly obvious the whole game is about sex and sexuality and navigating those, especially in online digital space. But it did so in, I thought, a really cool and unique way. It didn't have an explicit sex scene, but it was entirely about sex. It was a very open, frank conversation about it. And I think that kind of discussion is something I hope to see more things like that.
It's Nina Freeman, right?
Yeah.
Yes. All of her games just can be looked at, I think, as like little case studies of like ways to talk about sex in a game in an efficient way that doesn't seem infantile or childish or, you know.
Yeah. And I'm not saying like no sex scenes in games, like, but I really like that kind of different take on it.
I think / hope that there will be more playable female characters in the future. I mean, I know there obviously are some, but people are getting less and less tolerant of the excuses that studios make about why they can't do playable female characters. And once there are more of those and it becomes more mainstream, I think hopefully we'll see more sexuality that's not just something that we watch, but something we control a little bit more.
Yeah.
I think, and like sort of along with that, I see a possible future where we're kind of hopefully near the end of the sexuality phase. That's another Megan line where like, you know, Dragon Age 2 was all about whoever you want to be sexually attracted to can be sexually attracted to you. Yeah. Whereas Inquisition, there are limits. Some people will not accept your advances no matter how nice you are to them because they're not into you, because they're gay, because they're straight. And so I hope that we see a future not where all of the sexual options are available to you, but where in the like general field of all games, there are a variety of different set options. So it's not like, oh, you can be either a woman or a man who is attracted to whatever gender. It's this character is attracted to this person. This is how this character gets played. But a variety of those characters.
And it doesn't eliminate the gay button, but it makes it more complicated because you can press the straight button and they can be like, hell no.
Yeah, exactly. So like I think that would be nice, like to see a future of games where there is
a gay dimmer switch.
Or just like, I'm playing this character and he is attracted to other men.
Yeah.
And that's just his character.
Yeah.
To me, if like when I saw that as a mainstream act in games, I would feel like, oh, we've gotten there.
I think that's a big thing with all aspects of video games, full stop, is hopefully we're getting in the direction where it's like, for a while it was like, the most interesting video games you can make are made by making the most possible options, and your character can be literally anyone who would do or say anything. They can be evil, they can be good, they can be evil, they can be good. Like, they can be so evil. And it's just like...
That's everything.
And it's like, I'm so fucking sick of that. I want characters.
Gone Home and Life is Strange are sexual, but it's not sexualized.
No, absolutely not. Like, if someone had told me about, like, 4 years ago been like, hey, Emma, listen to these games that are being made, I would have been like, yeah, right. Yeah, right. Like, no way. And I think both of those are such great indications. The sexuality is at the forefront of what's happening in those games. And like, I would have never thought that was something that would happen. So I guess that's some progress.
I'd love to see that as the future of like sex in games, is like genuine sexuality rather than sexualization.
Yeah, because we've had to take so many times, I guess, sexualization as sort of
that's it,
the consolation prize.
Yeah,
it's like, yeah, you can't get sexuality without it being sexualized for the male gaze. That is why you end up with these characters we may like Lara Croft or Jill Valentine or Bayonetta. But you also have this idea that there's like that this is not for me.
It's not. Yeah, it's not for me.
I'd also add that like these wish lists are great, and we won't see them happen, at least outside of the margins. We see all these games, but it's just like, hire these people at your game studios, AAA studios, please. Like, hire these people, get writers in there that know how to write this shit, because they're out there. Yeah, but you don't have anyone.
Freeman a hell of a job.
You know what I mean?
And
because we're not going to see these games until we get people that know what they're doing.
Yeah.
Or at least are able to be in positions of power where they can make these narrative directions in the games. Which is, unfortunately, I don't see around the corner, but it will happen eventually.
Thank you for listening to the First Person Podcast. We would like to thank Neil Randall and the staff of the Games Institute for their support, as well as Elise Vist, our podcast producer. We would also like to thank Stephen Trothan, who wrote and composed our theme music.
Make me gay.
What's your root?
That is not a question on my list.
No, I'm kidding.